Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Fortier, and I'm the Communications and Member Services Coordinator with New Hampshire Municipal Association. We're glad that you're here today to join us for this webinar called Here Comes the Parade. Are your volunteers and recreational staff ready? I am joined today by two individuals, Kerry Horne, who's the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Recreation and Parks Association. Good afternoon, Kerry.
Good afternoon, Tim.
And Margaret Byrnes, our NHMA Staff Attorney. Good afternoon, Margaret.
Good afternoon, Tim.
And we do welcome the members of the New Hampshire Recreation and Parks Association. We hope you enjoyed this webinar today. Have some housekeeping chores I'd like to attend to. As you can see, if you hit that orange arrow, it will collapse your screen, and then if you hit it again, it'll bring it back. We will be taking questions today, so feel free to provide them to us. You can put those questions in the red box, send it to us, and if we have time, we will answer those questions during the webinar. And if we don't have time, we will follow up with you after the webinar with responses. We do have a couple pop quizzes today. We hope that you'll join us. And Kerry tells me that she knows how to raise a hand, and we're going to try that feature as well. I think there's a couple times we're going to ask you to raise your hand, so hopefully you'll participate with that as well. Before we get started, wanted you to know that you've got three handouts that you can review. One is recent changes in the law regarding background checks. And the other two are publications, past publications of the Property Liability Trust, one a volunteer manual, and the other one a special events planning guidebook. And I think Kerry plans to talk a little bit further about that further in this program. So we hope that you enjoy the show today. Feel free to circulate what will be a YouTube presentation of production after this webinar. You should receive it in a couple days, and we hope that you'll share it with other municipal colleagues and friends. With that, I'd like to turn the program over to Margaret.
All right, good afternoon again, everyone. Thanks for being here with us this afternoon. Our primary focus of today's webinar is on volunteers because, of course, the programs that you put on throughout the summer, throughout the year, really, depend a lot upon volunteers. And so I'm going to start with sort of just the basic legal concepts and considerations related to using volunteers in the programs that you do. And then Kerry's going to pick up the remainder of the presentation talking specifically about volunteer risk management. So let's get started here talking about volunteers. One of the important questions, or the first important question to ask yourself, is whether the person or the individuals that you're using who are doing work for you, who are assisting in your program, your summer camp, whatever it is you're putting on, are these people volunteers or are they employees? And so we're going to look at the standard for determining whether a person is a volunteer. A lot of people ask, well, why does it matter? Why is it so important? Why do we spend all this time analyzing whether someone's a volunteer or an employee? Isn't it simple? And it's not always perfectly simple, but it matters a lot. It matters because employees get all of the protections, statutory protections, as well as protections under personnel policies and other rules and laws, while volunteers don't. So it's very important that we, from the start, classify people properly as volunteer or employee. And it's important, too, that we realize that just because we call someone a volunteer doesn't mean they are. They have to meet the tests. They have to meet the legal requirements for being a volunteer. So let's take a look at what those requirements are. Very basically, and both under New Hampshire law as well as under federal law, the basic requirements for being a volunteer is that the individual freely offers his or her services, that it's for some kind of civic or humanitarian purpose, that it's not for the purpose of getting a promotion, getting a job, that that's not the motivation behind it, and that the individual has no expectation of receiving compensation. So these are sort of the three basic things that every volunteer has to have. When it comes to freely offering services, it's important that there's no kind of coercion of any kind to get this volunteer to do this this job for you. Let's say that you have an administrative assistant in your municipality, and the supervisor of the administrative assistant says, knows that there's this summer program that they're putting on and that they're kind of desperate for some more volunteers. And the supervisor would really like to get some more of the town employees engaged and would like to get them to volunteer their time. And the supervisor says, I think that people in town would really appreciate, the taxpayers would really appreciate it if they could see more of our employees engaging in these programs, that people might feel more engaged if the people who work in town would volunteer their time outside of their work hours. I'm not saying you have to do it, but it would be really great if you could. Even subtle things like that, any kind of pressure, any kind of suggestion that those who volunteer their time outside of work hours are doing something better than those who don't, that can be seen as a form of coercing your employees to volunteer their time. And if that's the case, if the person has been coerced, they're not going to be a volunteer because they're not fully and freely offering their service, just for the purpose of bettering the community of their own free will. There also has to be that there's no expectation of anything. I mentioned that there's no expectation that a job will come out of it, that a promotion will come out of it. There's no expectation that they're going to be paid compensation. Again, this has to be free will, offering their free time to do the volunteering for no other purpose than to get the benefit of volunteering, which is being engaged in the community. Now, in addition to those very basic standards, the federal law, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which we often hear just referred to as the FLSA, has some other additional components to it. One of the important components to the FLSA is that volunteers are allowed to be paid some kind of money without losing their volunteer status. The key is that no volunteer can ever be paid compensation. Compensation is something we pay to employees. It's something that's tied to productivity, to hours worked. It's the salary, it's the hourly wage that employees get. A volunteer can't get that kind of compensation that's tied to their hourly work or their productivity. But under the FLSA, a volunteer can get reimbursed for expenses. So if the volunteer has to purchase something as part of the volunteering, perhaps a baseball cap or a t-shirt that all the volunteers wear. They can also be given reasonable benefits or a nominal fee. So they can be sort of reimbursed for travel expenses, for food, for things of that nature. They can even receive a nominal fee, which again is not compensation, but is just sort of a thank you pay for the time and effort that the volunteer puts into volunteering. The FLSA has given us some standards to use when determining whether a fee is nominal or not. Some more sort of ambiguous standards, such as a fee is nominal if it varies as the particular individual spends more or less time engaged in the volunteer activity. So that's an example of when a fee has gone from nominal to compensation. But some of the factors are the distance traveled and the time and effort expended by the volunteer, whether the volunteer has agreed to be available around the clock or only during certain specified time periods, whether the volunteer provides services as needed or throughout the year. So you can look at sort of the effort and the total amount of time a volunteer puts into the work in determining how much of a nominal fee you might give. But what you can't do is say, okay, for every hour we're just going to pay you $5. That would be clearly tied to productivity, and that would be essentially in lieu of getting compensation, and now you're in danger of sort of losing that volunteer status. Another guideline the Department of Labor has put out for determining whether a fee is nominal is the so-called 20% test. So this says that as long as the amount, the fee that your volunteer is getting, does not exceed 20% of what an employee doing that same job would be paid for compensation, then that fee is probably a nominal fee. So it can be good to use if you're not sure if the fee that you're paying your volunteer is really nominal, if it sort of exceeds that level. Take a look at the 20% test and compare it to what a regular employee would be paid for doing that same job, sort of in that same arena. The second point on this slide is the prohibition on an employee volunteering to provide the same or similar services. I think a lot of you have probably heard about this. If you haven't, this is a really important one to keep in mind because, again, many of your employees in your municipality, they want to volunteer. They do want to help out at the summer program or at some program that's happening after work hours. It's perfectly fine to have your employees also volunteer their time in your municipality, in your school district. But what's really important is that the FLSA expressly prohibits employees from volunteering to perform the same job or a similar job that they are paid to perform as an employee. So an example is, say you have a highway agent, a road agent, or a public works person. Their work is handling the roads and plowing the roads and grading the roads. They can't volunteer to do some road maintenance activities outside of their regular workday because those are the same job duties that they do as an employee for the municipality. So on the other hand, if the recreation director wants to volunteer to coach the soccer team, then that's a totally different job than what they're doing as the road agent or the public works person. So really important that when you have your employees volunteering, they're not volunteering to do the work that they do as an employee of the municipality. Of course, a lot of the volunteers that you get will probably be youth, young people who want to volunteer. They have the summers off. They want to help with the recreation program, with the summer camp in your municipality, which is perfectly fine. And of course, it's a great way to get young people in your town engaged with other people in the community. Just some important things to keep in mind is that New Hampshire law does have some very specific rules about children under a certain age volunteering to do work. And that statute is RSA Chapter 276-A. You see it up there on your slide. We won't go through all the very detailed requirements in there, but just sort of to give you a rundown of what's in there. One of the important things in that statute is that a young person, someone under 18 of almost any age, is allowed to engage in what's called casual work. This is work that's infrequent, it's of a brief duration, it has little or sporadic income, it's not commonly held to establish an employer-employee relationship, and so being involved in a day of uncompensated volunteer work is probably not going to violate any laws when you have a young person doing that. There are also some restrictions on youth under the age of 16 working with hazardous equipment or doing hazardous activities, and what the statute says is that they are prohibited from engaging in any activity deemed to be hazardous under state or federal labor laws. All right, so a little ambiguous, but in practice, let's use our common sense. We should not be having, you know, a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old operating equipment that can hurt him or her, such as the lawnmower, you know, big, heavy equipment or equipment of any nature that can cause serious injuries. If you're going to have sort of a long-term relationship or a longer-term relationship with a volunteer who is under the age of 18, so something more than just sort of this one day or a few days of infrequent casual work, it's important to keep in mind some other requirements that will probably now apply with that longer-term relationship. And again, these are set forth in 276-A. And I've also put up there on the screen the New Hampshire Department of Labor rules, Labor Rule 1000, which, again, important to keep in mind that, as a side note, when you're looking at these statutes, especially these labor statutes, there are almost always corresponding administrative rules that you can find on the New Hampshire Department of Labor website. So you should look not only at the statute, but also at the rules that apply to further sort of describe the requirements that are found in the statute. So some of those other additional requirements that might apply, a youth between the ages of 12 and 15 must have a youth employment certificate certificate. This is a document issued by a school that the youth attends. The requirements for it are in those Department of Labor rules that are up there on your screen. Someone who is 16 or 17 years old and not yet a high school graduate also needs to have written permission signed by a parent or a guardian to engage in this longer term type of work. And there are also restrictions on when young people can work. This is really important. During the summer months, during vacation time, the restrictions are more lax. They can work more. But during the school year, if you have someone volunteering or doing work during the school year, they can work far fewer hours because they're in school and the focus has to be on being in school. So make sure that you look at the statute and you look at the rules and you determine is this, first of all, is this young person going to be working for us during the school year or during a vacation time? And given the time of the year they're going to be working for us, what are the restrictions on the hours that they can work? Also, and I think that Kerry will get into this, you know, think carefully about what kinds of responsibilities you want the kids who are volunteering for you to be doing. They shouldn't be working, obviously they can't be working with the hazardous equipment, but they also shouldn't be working with highly sensitive or very difficult matters and duties, records that need to be kept confidential,
handling
money,
yeah.
Things like that. You know, there are plenty of things that kids can do to help run a program successfully, but not the big important stuff. That's really
Absolutely.
important to keep in mind. There is a question up here on the screen. It says, what if an administrative assistant or other municipal employee wants to volunteer at an election? That is a very good question. I think what I would love to do is talk about with you off the webinar, talk about with you what type of employee that is and what kind of volunteering duties they would be doing at the election. So I know who you are. Give me a call. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide and talk a little bit about background checks. And I do see we have a couple other questions up here on the screen that we'll get to in a moment, but let's just talk about background checks here for a moment. There are really two important statutes when it comes to background checks. The first statute up here is 41 section 9-B. And this statute gives the governing body the discretion to decide whether to obtain a background investigation and a criminal history record check for certain types of prospective employees, and that can include prospective volunteers as well. The type of people who the governing body can get those optional background checks are in that statute are those who are going to work with or around children or elderly persons, people who are going to enter the homes of citizens or collect or manage money. So these kinds of job duties, whether they're volunteer job duties or whether they're employee job duties, the governing body has the discretion to obtain these background checks on these individuals. And the statute allows the governing body to obtain either a state records check or both a federal and a state records check for any of these individuals. You would need to get a release form. And again, it doesn't mandate background checks on these individuals, but it does give the option of doing it. And clearly, this is just one more step you can take to make sure that the people you're bringing in, especially people who are going to work with children, as many of your programs will do, really just another way to vet and make sure that you're getting the kind of people into your program that you really want to have working in your program. The big change, though, you've got 41-9-B, the optional background checks, but we have this big change in the law, and it's a change from the time that your volunteer manual that you all received by email was published. And so for that reason, we've included this separate handout. It's the one entitled Changes in the Law Background Checks. And this change comes in statute RSA 485-A, section 24, and it applies to youth skill camps. So on page 12 of your volunteer manual, it says basically there's no time that anyone is ever required, that a municipality or employee is ever required to do a background check. But 485-A 24 has now changed that, being amended in the last few years. Basically what it says is that no person or entity, for profit or for a charitable purpose, can operate a youth skill camp without maintaining an appropriate policy regarding background checks for camp owners, employees, and volunteers who may be left alone with a child or with children. So now there is a specific mandate that anyone running a youth skill camp must have a policy for obtaining the background checks for people who are working with children. Very important. And yes, it does apply to you, the municipality, if you're running a program that meets this definition, which is a youth skill camp is a nonprofit or a for-profit program that lasts 8 hours total or more in a year for the purpose of teaching a skill to minors. I don't think the skill has to be very specific. We're talking about a summer camp where kids have fun and learn to do different things. It says camps include, the teaching of sports, the arts, scientific inquiry, but I think we can say that, just apply it broadly. If you have a situation where you have a camp for children like this that lasts 8 hours or more during the year, you need to be complying with 485-A, Section 24. You need to have a policy for obtaining background checks on everyone who's involved. And what it requires basically is that you have a policy, that policy is certified to the Department of Environmental Services, and you also certify to the department that each person that you bring on as a volunteer or an employee has never caused or threatened direct physical injury to any individual and has not caused or threatened harm in any nature to any child or children. So this is all, again, it starts with 485-A, Section 24, but what it does is in the New Hampshire Administrative Code, Rule 900 that you see up on your screen on youth camps, that's where really the details of how you put into effect your background check and how you do it all is really put into more detail there.
Margaret, can I just jump in for a
Yeah,
second?
of course.
I think we also need to remember that a lot of rec departments hire people to come in and run, for example, a youth soccer camp or different types of camps. I believe that you need to also then make sure that whoever owns that camp is following the same procedure. So just because you're hiring somebody out to run that camp for you doesn't mean you're off the hook. So just make sure that you're with your due diligence in terms of that.
Absolutely. It's very broad. It basically wants you to do a background check on any person involved with working with children, and that falls into the definition of the youth skill camp. All right, just one last point here I'm going to make on sort of the drier legal aspect of all of this is volunteer immunity. Volunteers do receive special immunity protections. And what are we talking about with immunity? This means that a volunteer, if they cause injury to another person while volunteering for your municipality, while volunteering for your program, is not, even if they are responsible, they're going to be protected from being responsible, from being liable for the actions that they took, but only if they meet very specific standards that you see up here on the screen in RSA 508, Section 17. The first requirement is that the governmental entity has a record indicating that the person claiming to be a volunteer is a volunteer. Kerry will tell you again later on, you need to have a written record that shows that, yes, we've brought on such and such a person to volunteer as such and such a volunteer. Even if it's very simple, you need to have something.
So those of you that know me, Margaret, I'll tell you this.
Yeah.
My famous last words are, if it's not written or documented, it didn't happen.
Of course. And so, this is just a sort of another reason to get that documentation, but there are so many reasons to do it. The second standard is that the volunteer was acting in good faith and within the scope of his or her official functions and duties with the organization. So the immunity is only going to protect a volunteer if he or she is doing the volunteer duties that he or she is there to do. So if the volunteer is off doing something totally unrelated and causes some kind of injury, this isn't going to protect him or her, because this is a statute that protects people who are acting as volunteers. And the final piece of this is that whatever damage or injury the volunteer causes cannot be caused by willful, wanton, or grossly negligent misconduct by the volunteer. So if the volunteer intentionally punches someone, or the volunteer is grossly negligent, it's beyond the pale of reasonable behavior, then what it does is it takes us outside of the immunity statute. And that's pretty typical for immunity statutes. Look, you're going to get protection if you're acting within the duties you're set to do, if you're acting in good faith, but if you engage in some horrible or willful intentional conduct, you're outside of that protection, and you're outside of the scope of what the immunity is meant to protect you from. One of the sort of sticky points about this statute is that it says that for a person to be a volunteer and to get this immunity, and remember, this is a New Hampshire statute, it says that the person cannot receive any compensation. That's the definition of a volunteer in this statute. An individual performing services for a nonprofit organization or governmental entity who does not receive compensation other than reimbursement for expenses actually incurred or for such services. The reason this is extra tricky is because, remember back to a few slides ago, we said that under the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, that volunteers can, in addition to getting reimbursement for expenses, they can also get other things like reasonable benefits and a nominal fee. But what this statute seems to say is that only those volunteers who don't receive anything other than reimbursement, only those volunteers get the express immunity granted in 508 section 17. Now, whether, I'm not aware of any case that deals directly with that question of whether, a volunteer who received more than just reimbursement was still going to be protected under the volunteer immunity statute, but that's something to keep in mind when you decide whether you're going to, I think, give more benefits to your volunteer other than just reimbursement for expenses, is whether this may take them outside of the volunteer immunity statute 508 section 17. There are some additional immunity statutes in your handbook, in your volunteer handbook, such as the Good Samaritan statute, and also special liability protection for physicians or emergency medical service people, so some other protections that may apply in these situations. But finally, just keep in mind that even if your volunteer does fall under 508 section 17 and is protected, it doesn't necessarily protect the municipality, so a municipality can still be liable for acts of a volunteer. A municipality can also be liable for, let's say, negligently supervising a volunteer, or negligently putting a volunteer into a position that the municipality knew or should have known was likely to cause some kind of injury. So failing to do a background check, or not supervising someone, some volunteer you've never had work there before, and you just sort of send them out to work with all the tiny children, and something really bad happens, someone could bring a claim saying that, the municipality, the recreation department, whoever it was who was putting on the program, was negligent in putting that individual into that situation. So there can still be liability on a municipality in those situations. That shouldn't stop you from bringing on volunteers. It should just encourage you to do all of the great things that Kerry's going to talk to you about with managing your risk.
All right, thank you, Margaret. Actually, your last slide is a perfect lead-in to my portion of the webinar. And again, the stuff that I'm going to talk about, if you have nothing right now, if you're sitting here listening to this and you have no resources in terms of volunteer management, we're giving it to you. So as Tim mentioned at the beginning, you have a full volunteer manual packet. We invite you, make it your own. Use the documents that we provided, make them fit for your community. And again, my biggest thing is document, document, document. If it's not written down and you can't prove it or have it listed somewhere, then like I said before, it never happened. So here's my word of advice, my legal disclaimer. I'm not an attorney, Margaret is, so she can jump in whenever, whenever she feels. But more on behalf of municipalities, you should always seek professional legal advice anytime you're dealing with waivers or anything that concerns liability or risk management around volunteers and employees. It's always a great idea to make sure to put that reminder out there for you. So my first few slides, these are things that I want you to consider as I move through my piece of the presentation. Almost a checklist in your own mind of things that you hopefully have as a recreation director or a person in your community who works with volunteers. And again, if not, this isn't to shame anybody, but it's to give you the resources and tools that you need to make sure that you're protected, so that all the stuff that Margaret talked about, it always occurs to me that people always think of that will never happen here. Well, unfortunately, if it does happen in your community, you'll have done the due diligence and you'll have all the paperwork and things to protect you. So if, God forbid, something does happen, then you'll be ready to move forward with that. So some things to consider. I think one of the biggest things that you need to think about is finding the right person for the right position. You don't want to just throw a warm body in any situation. You want to make sure that the person that you're bringing on as a volunteer fits the description of what you're looking for them to do. I was a Parks and Rec director for 13 years with the town of Farmington before, coming over here, and I can tell you we use volunteers for a number of things, and they all had different nuances to them, whether it was someone volunteering at Old Home Day or a half marathon or in your youth programs. You want to make sure that it's the right fit. How are you going to know if it's a right fit? If you don't go through the process of an application process or of a checklist of some sort, then you're not going to know if truly the person is right for the position. Are your volunteers qualified? How do you know? How do you know if someone fits the need if you don't ask? So again, these are things I want you to think about. Do you have an application or a screening process? Okay? And that's important to know, because one of the things that, again, if something happens, what the courts or the legal folks will look at is, what did you do in the background? What paperwork can you provide? Do you have a paper trail for your process, and is it consistent? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Two of the big ones, and again, I know a lot of you that are out there, and I hope you're all doing this, is how do you train your volunteers and who supervises them? Those are all things that you should be able to answer right now. In your own mind, you should be saying, yep, we do this training for these types of volunteers, and this person in the department is responsible for supervision. Because when things happen or when things go wrong, that's not the time to figure out who's in charge.
And Kerry, I just want to interrupt and say,
Yeah,
I know we have a number of questions up here on the screen. I just want to address two right now. We actually got the same question from two different people, which is, what about court-ordered community service? We consider them volunteers, but they do not freely offer their services. This is not about court-ordered volunteers. That is a totally different animal. A court has said that they're required to do a certain amount of work as part of their sentence, and all of that. So we're talking here about the volunteers that come to you and work for you freely in your programs and in your municipalities. Kerry, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
Well, I will say that a lot of times the recreation department is where these people end up. Mm-hmm. So, I think you can, if you have things, obviously you have to think about what the issue is, and you're probably not going to know too much about why the person is being sent to you. But I know in my 13 years, we did work collaboratively with our local law enforcement office that if they thought they had someone who was a good fit.
Yes.
So I would recommend making sure that there's that connection. You have to think about people, personal privacy and those types of things, but you have to make sure it's a good fit, because you don't want someone who's on community service for something that
violent,
right, you don't want them around children, but can they work at your Old Home Day or do some type of maintenance in your building? That may be a fit, and honestly, a lot of folks do end up there. So I think you can apply some of the same principles, but you are right, they're different. They're different beasts.
But I think that's great advice, that you should be in communication with local law enforcement about those individuals.
Yep, and I know we had a great relationship, and that's how ours worked. And we used a lot of court-ordered volunteer service, because sometimes people just do things and they need to pay their dues, and it is another great opportunity to be able to have people help.
Absolutely.
So, all right, so some other things to consider, and I put down driving in this slide, but there's some other special considerations. Obviously, if someone's going to be driving a vehicle, you want to look at things as, have you checked their motor vehicle record? That sounds silly, but if they're going to be driving a municipal vehicle for anything, you might have a van in your summer camp program. Are you asking someone who's a volunteer to jump in and drive, kids from your rec center to the park? You want to think about that. If they're driving their own car, there are certainly other things that you want to consider, especially if they're putting, your participants in their car. Other things to think about, anytime you have anybody that's dealing with money or equipment or personal protective equipment, these are all special, what I like to call special considerations that we'll talk more about as the presentation goes. But think about those special areas, because those are the ones that you need to really focus on. Finally, before we jump into the risk management cycle, nobody wants to think about if a volunteer or if anybody gets hurt. But again, now is the time to plan for that. So do you have a plan in place? That's what you should be asking yourself right now. If someone is volunteering in your program and they get hurt, what happens? Does the volunteer know where to go? Do you have policies and procedures in place? Are there forms that volunteer needs to fill out? If somebody's volunteering for you, let's say that they're volunteering as a coach or an umpire in your league, and they work in a real 9-to-5 job, and they get hurt, and that takes them out of that job. Those are things that you want to consider ahead of time. What assistance, what you can provide to them. So again, we should be thinking along those lines. Nobody wants to think of the worst case scenario, but I think you do yourself, a disjustice if you don't think of those things ahead of time. Again, I mentioned waivers. I know in rec departments we use them for a lot of different things, and again, volunteers is another area where you probably should be using waivers. We're not going to get into that too much here today. Again, you should always talk with your legal counsel, with your town managers to discuss what types of forms you're going to be using, because they can be important. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what I call the volunteer risk management cycle, and that really has 5 different components. It starts with recruitment. So before you even get that volunteer on board, how are you getting them? Where are you getting your volunteers from? What things do you need to consider during that time frame? Then you talk about the application and the screening process. Then you move into your selection and orientation. This probably sounds more like a job cycle than a volunteer cycle, but again, you want to almost mimic what you do for your full-time employees with your volunteers, and I think that's a good philosophy to have. Next comes training and supervision, and then comes evaluation and recognition. All of these things are what I would consider critical parts of a volunteer risk management program. And I think that we're going to touch on all of them, but again, the volunteer manual really dives into what things you should be looking at as you move forward with your volunteer program. Oh, it's time for Tim's poll here. I'm very excited about this one.
Well, yes, thank you for advancing the slide, Kerry. Where is the geographic center of New Hampshire? We have Holderness, Plymouth, Ashland, Bristol, and Bridgewater, which, guess what, is pretty much in the center of New Hampshire, but which one has the title of being the geographic center? And with that, I will launch the poll and give you a couple seconds to respond.
If you're asleep, it's time to wake up and answer Tim's poll, please.
Thank you. Thank you. We usually wait until we get about 75% having voted, and then we'll launch the results.
I'll be honest, I had no idea, but Tim knows the answer, so we're covered.
I do. And we are at about 75%, so I'm going to close the poll. I'm going to give everyone one last second. If you haven't voted, please vote. Okay. I'm going to share.
How does it look, Tim?
Well, the geographic center is C, Ashland. In fact, I spoke with Charles Smith, the town administrator in Ashland, just yesterday, and he informs me that that little moniker is on the badges of their police officers. Ashland is the center of New Hampshire.
Love it.
Got some good trivia now. If you didn't know that today, look what you learned today. All right. Okay, so moving forward. In a minute, I'm going to do our first raise your hand poll, so I'm going to get Tim ready for that. I'm giving him a heads up. In the recruitment phase, here are things that we want to think about. First and foremost, if you aren't really sure where you use volunteers, it's a great time to sit down. If you have a board or a commission or a group of your employees, sit down and have a brainstorming session about where do you truly need volunteers. Is it your old home day? Is it your parade? Where do you need, where do you need those volunteers? And that's really a good starting point. We also, in the volunteer manual, there are different forms that you can put out there. You may want to have on your website just a volunteer form that sits out there so that if somebody is looking for a volunteer position, they can come in and fill it out. And then you can look at it as you need volunteers. This is my first raise your hand, so everybody get ready to raise your hand on your, not your real hand, don't sit at your computer and raise your hand, but raise it on your, you could, but we wouldn't see it. So raise your hand if you currently have position descriptions for your volunteers.
See. I see some hands, Tim.
I see some hands. We're seeing the hands on the little, next to their names.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right. So I'm seeing a few, but I'm not seeing a lot. So that either means you've checked out or you don't have job descriptions for your volunteers. So this is one of the takeaways from today. It doesn't have to be rocket science, but you really should have something written about why you have this person as a volunteer. If it's for your old home day, it should be a, it doesn't have to be a full page, and there are examples in the volunteer manual, but it should be something that indicates why you're putting this person to work as a, not to work, but to volunteer. Okay, so make sure that you do that. That's your homework if you don't have any position descriptions. Where do you find volunteers? Again, I think Margaret mentioned that a lot of times you're going to use youth. A lot of high schools today are instituting requirements that the students have to do community service hours. So there's a lot of volunteers that are out there, especially those juniors and seniors who are procrastinating. A lot of, my daughter's one of them, so we'll be finding some volunteer work. If you have colleges that are in your community, a lot of times there will be different groups on campus that are willing to come in and help with that. Another population that we may not think of, but our senior citizens. They are, oftentimes a wealth of knowledge that can come in and serve as volunteer. But remember, whether it's someone who's 16 or someone who's 80, you need to go through the same process for your volunteers as you get them through the cycle. Whoops. Sorry, I went the wrong way. All right, back going this way. We're live here, so. All right, so the application and screening process. Again, there's sample applications in the volunteer manual. If you don't currently use an application, you really should. Again, it doesn't have to be something that's very difficult. You can use the same generic volunteer application for all different types of volunteers. And again, it's probably better to keep it consistent so that you can customize it if you need to, but everybody's filling out the same form. And you may think, well, they're only a volunteer, so why do I really need to have that? It's so important to have that paper trail so that you went through the entire process, because if you do it for one person and then you don't do it for the next, then there's no consistency there. And again, if something happens, legally speaking, Margaret can obviously jump in, but people, the courts or the legal folks will look at what are towns around you doing? What is the standard in the state? Do other folks have these types of materials available as well?
Absolutely.
Interview questions. I could ask you all to raise your hands again, but I won't. How many of you actually take the time to sit down, whether you call it a formal interview or just a discussion or a meeting with a person that's coming in to volunteer? Because I can tell you right now, same thing as when you're doing when you're hiring somebody, you can tell a lot from a person when you sit down and have a conversation with them. What someone looks like on paper may be completely different than what they are actually in person. And I think that's an important thing for everybody to go through. So you don't have to necessarily call it an interview, but in the volunteer manual, there's a list of suggested questions that you can go through with the person, or just have a sit down with them so that you have it documented that you did meet with this person before you brought them on as an official volunteer. Margaret talked about background checks, and I even put on their references in your application. There's nothing wrong with asking someone to put down a reference. It can be a personal reference. If you have someone who's in high school, ask them to put down a teacher or someone who's recommending them for that position. Again, it's just another step in what I consider your due diligence in the volunteer risk management process. All right, you want to make sure that through this process that you are keeping it the same for everybody. I know different times of the year are busy. If you have what's considered maybe a quiet time of year for you, and as many of you are gearing up to get into your summer programs and your special events as the weather gets warmer, now is probably a really good time to look at what, if you have one, what does your volunteer cycle look like? Make sure it's the same for everything, whether it's something that's happening in October, if you're hosting a haunted house, or if you're having your Easter egg hunt. You want the same process for the volunteers that are coming. Yes, I'm even talking about if you have a one-day event, you should have some type of a record on hand in terms of who is at that event. In terms of getting permission, there's also in your packet, your volunteer manual, have them sign off that they understand that you're checking their background, that they understand that you're calling their references. You're asking them to give you permission to do that, and that certainly doesn't hurt in the process. Don't do it all yourself. If you have a board, if you have other volunteers, if you have people that work on a committee for a program or in your summer camp programs, involve other people in the process. Get other people's opinions in terms of the fit for a volunteer. I'm sure many of you out there have had to, I know I have in the past, have had to let a volunteer go, and that's probably one of the hardest things that you can do, but sometimes it's not a good fit. No, keep going, okay. We have a lot of questions coming in, and we will get to them. We're just going to get through the rest of the presentation first, and then we'll get to those at the end. All right, so selection and orientation, again, in your volunteer risk management manual, there is a sample of a letter of agreement, an orientation checklist, and there is the actual volunteer handbook. We highly recommend that you take a look at those, that you make them your own. We've received permission from the county of Henrico, Virginia, which is where we adopted our volunteer manual from, to use this information. They created it so that others out there wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. So make it your own. You can certainly leave them, as a reference of where you got it from, but it's important to make sure you have all of these things as well. Things like a code of conduct. This just outlines your expectations for your volunteers. If they don't know what's expected of them, if you don't want them showing up to, your old home day in cutoff jeans and a tank top, if you don't want them, using foul language in your youth leagues, if you don't want them doing, anything, you need to make sure that you have their expectations outlined in your code of conduct.
And I think too that this draws back to the fact that volunteers are not subject to your personnel policy. So don't think that, you bring the volunteers on and then when they do something that violates your personnel policy, you can simply say, well, this section of the personnel policy says you can't do that. They're not employees, they're volunteers. So Kerry's point about having a separate code of conduct for volunteers, I think is really, really important.
It's better to do it now than for somebody to say, I didn't know, I didn't understand that. And in your, in your volunteer manual, when you look through it, you can have them sign off that they read it, that they understand it, that they've gone through it, so that if something does happen, instead of pulling out your personnel policy, you pull out the binder that says volunteer risk management, and you're ready to go. One thing I do want to talk a little bit about is a time log and a special event log. If you have a one-day activity, a lot of you are going to be having Easter egg hunts soon. If you have people that are coming to volunteer their time, you always want to make sure that you document who is there and when. Because let's say somebody rolls their ankle in the field that you're doing the Easter egg hunt in or the egg hunt in, and they don't come back to you until a week later. If you don't have documentation, or a month later and they say that they got hurt, you need to be able to say, yes, these people were volunteering at that time. Those of you that have youth leagues and run concession stands, again, I always recommend just take a clipboard, put the volunteer sign in, sign out, the date on top of it, the time, so that you have a document of who was there, of who was participating. Anytime you're dealing with money, again, I think those folks should always go through a full background check. I'm talking about concessions, or if you have people that are working at your old home or your special town celebration days and they're collecting money. Again, those I consider those special considerations. You definitely want anybody to participate in the time log, but again, that would require the full process here.
And Kerry, we do have a question up here that says, does the manual, so this would be the volunteer manual, address one-time volunteers versus an ongoing volunteer? I don't know if you want to address that.
It's a tough one because how do you know if they're just going to be a one-time volunteer? For me, what I would do initially, again, if you're having an egg hunt next week and you have 4 people that just show up and help you, have a log with you. Just have them sign in, have them sign the log. If it goes beyond that, I would always go through the full cycle. So it is hard because you do have a lot of one-day special events, but if it's something that you know you're going to use volunteers for annually, have that log sheet ready, have a book with all of your special events ready ahead of time, be prepared. So I would say at a minimum, use the special event log, which is a sample is on your screen now. It's in the book as well. It lists what the event is, what time, what date, what location, and then everybody puts their name, they sign in, they sign out. So that would be the minimum that I would recommend for that.
Very good.
All right, on to training and supervision. This is a big area, and again, we only have about 10 minutes left, so we can't spend a lot of time going into detail, but this is an area that you have to pay attention to. You go through the due diligence of filling out the paperwork, getting the backgrounds checked, getting them logged, getting a volunteer up and ready to go, and then you just let them go. And you don't train them in anything. You don't teach them what you want them to do. You don't show them where the supplies and the equipment are. That's a big miss. We need to make sure that we're doing our due diligence. When you're starting with a new volunteer, it's essentially almost the same as starting with a new employee.
Sure.
You still have responsibility there. So make sure that you have a training schedule. Make sure they understand what they need. If you're not their direct supervisor, make sure that they know who their direct supervisor is. Make sure they know where they're signing in on a daily basis. And again, some of those special circumstances, one of the biggest things that will get people in trouble is if people don't understand what they're doing. They don't understand, I think you heard Margaret say, the scope of their duty. That's huge, because if something happens and then the volunteer says, well, nobody told me, I didn't know, I wasn't trained, and you have no documentation to back up that yes, they were trained and that they were told what was expected of them, it doesn't look good in that situation. So
no, and it could lead to liability too. Absolutely. So if you have a volunteer who does something wrong, hurts someone, causes injury or damage, and then maybe they're immune because they were acting in their official capacity as a volunteer, or maybe there's a question about that. But then there's also the question of, well, maybe the municipality acted negligently because they didn't train them and they didn't supervise supervise them, and they had never met this person before and interviewed them. They just stuck them out there on the field and let them do what they were going to do, and that's negligent supervision or negligent hiring, and you could find yourself liable under those circumstances as well. So really important to take this advice that Kerry's giving in this part.
And another thing, one of the other bullets talks about confidentiality. Anything that you learn about a volunteer, you should treat it the same as if you learned it about an employee. You shouldn't be, if they divulge something to you about whatever, a medication or something that's happening in their family or whatever, that is still information that you need to keep. It may be important for you to understand, but you need to make sure that you treat it the same as you would with an employee's information. Hazards and personal protective equipment. We talked about the fact that you need to be training them for that, but are you making them aware of it? Are you providing them with personal protective equipment? If you have a 17-year-old that has their signed form from their parent and it's during the summertime and they've been trained to do the weed whacker or mow a lawn because they're a little bit older and they can handle that if they have the right training, but do they have the goggles? Do they have the correct, proper protective equipment? If you're asking someone to do cleaning, do they have gloves? Think about all of those things ahead of time, almost the same way you would as an employee, because really you should be preparing them very similar. We talked a little bit about injury reporting. If you don't have accident or incident forms, make sure you get them. There are examples in both the volunteer manual and I believe in the special events manual as well, because you want to make sure that you're documenting all of those things. And there, like I said, there are samples there. And if you can't find what you need, reach out to me and I can help you with that as well. The last piece of my part of the presentation talks about evaluation and recognition. And someone might be saying, why in the world would I want to evaluate a volunteer? Well, because you know what, if you have someone who's coming in every week for, Monday and Wednesday, every week for a year, they want feedback. They're a volunteer, and you should be giving them feedback on a consistent basis. Because if they're doing a great job, you want to let them know they're doing a great job. You want to let them know that what they're doing matters. And again, it's a good thing to have in your file, and not trying to give you more paperwork, but it's just that paper trail. If they're performing needs improvement, this is a great way to document it. Again, I've had to let a volunteer go in the past, and it really is truly one of the most uncomfortable things. It's probably harder than firing someone you hired because they're volunteering their time. But in that situation, it was not a good fit. And thankfully, we had documentation that backed up. So, it was not a fun conversation, but I could say we asked you to try and improve upon these things, and this really just isn't a match. So that is what leads to the termination. And again, you have every right to terminate a volunteer. If you do nothing and you have no paperwork and you just have the same volunteers that are showing up every year for these events, and every year you say, oh no, this person is back. Well, you're creating that issue for yourself, because yes. You're not, you can make a volunteer go from, Monday to Friday, or you can make it go for the entire 2017 year and then have them reapply next year. It just depends on what the situation is and what you need, but you really should be making that part of the process.
Yeah, and I would think that doing the evaluations too, Kerry, would allow you to say to the volunteer, well, this particular position was not the right fit, and we're going to use you over here. And maybe what it is maybe they're not as good with working with people, but they can do behind the scenes stuff and other stuff that needs to get done. So without that evaluation, it's hard to make that choice and to just move them from one thing to the next.
Absolutely. All right, so finally, and I just want to spend a moment here, it's so important to make sure that you recognize your volunteers. This is, I hate to say it, but one of the things sometimes we forget about, because they're so important, and without them, a lot of the programs that municipal recreation departments and municipalities run wouldn't happen. So make sure that you don't miss this step. It motivates your volunteers. It helps with retention, and a lot of them don't cost anything. Sometimes just sharing a coffee with someone or asking someone to come in and sit down so that that they can understand. It's even a huddle at the end of a long day saying, we couldn't have made gone through this day without you. But this is a step that you shouldn't miss. So on my next slide, there's just a few different ways that you can think about thanking your volunteers. I'm a huge fan of a personal note. In today's day and age of technology, everybody sends emails and voicemails. Take a few minutes of your time and write a handwritten note. Go old school, and people really enjoy that. Saying thank you goes a long way. Sometimes in the rush of a special event, we all get so caught up in the event that we forget that there are a lot of other people that made that happen. Some municipalities give all their volunteers T-shirts that say, I'm a volunteer, town of XYZ. That's a great way to motivate your volunteers. Some communities have levels. You've been here for this long, you get this. Again, they don't have to cost a lot, but it's a way to thank those volunteers that are consistently working with you. The next one is, I think it's a great time, anytime you work with someone or on a volunteer or a regular basis, when someone gets a quick note that says, hey, I know it's your birthday today, I remember it, thank you for what you do for us. That's a huge thing. A volunteer hall of fame, maybe somewhere in your building you have pictures of your volunteers that have been with you for a certain number of years. Everybody likes to see their pictures hanging in the hallway, especially if they've donated a lot of time for that. Another thing that I like is, if your department or your community has a lot of volunteers, put a volunteer box somewhere so that they can put in thoughts, suggestions, comments. If maybe there's even an issue that's occurring that they don't want to put their name to, they can put their thoughts or suggestions in the volunteer box. If you have any type of a annual event that you can recognize, whether it's at your town meeting, yes, or whether, you know, I think that's a great way to put some.
I think a lot of towns take a few minutes just to recognize or give the volunteer awards at the town meeting.
I know within NHRPA we have an actual award that you can nominate someone from in your community who does great volunteer work. So you can look for information on that on the NHRPA website. Newspapers, banners, again, as you're putting your information out there, if you're putting out a press release that thanks people for participating in your event, don't forget to mention your volunteers. And my last bit is just have a quick coffee talk. Just sit down, thank your volunteers. It really does, I said it before, but in this day and age of technology, I think sometimes we forget that the face-to-face is worth the most to most people today. So don't forget that step. It's an important piece. So we've come to another poll section here, Tim, and I'm not going to jump the gun on you this time.
We'll go forward.
All right.
Yes, we will. Okay, so the next poll question is, how many state parks are in New Hampshire? And we'll launch it. We'll ask that you participate with us.
And we will get to your questions after this or after.
And I see we're at about 37% having voted. So if you haven't yet voted, please do so.
Time to wake up.
We'll give this, keep the poll open just for another couple seconds. And come on, couple more votes. We're at 70% having voted.
If you don't know, just guess.
Okay, we seem, we're at 74%, so I'll wait for one last vote. Nope, we're going to launch it at 74%. Sorry. So close, and we're going to share. The answer is B, 42. There are 42 state parks in New Hampshire.
23% of you got that right.
That's right.
All right.
Thank you so much for participating with us.
Okay, we're going to wrap this up and then get to your questions. So my last few thoughts are just to wrap up what we talked about. Use common sense. This is not brain surgery or rocket science. This is things that you can do and you should do. And if you don't have these tools currently in your community, make sure that you take the time to get them ready and get them moving as we approach the busy summer season. Involve your volunteers. Get their feedback. If you have volunteers you currently work with, use them so that they can help you to develop this program. We talked about praising and correcting, and unfortunately sometimes you may have to remove a volunteer. Don't assume that your volunteers know everything. Okay? This is going to get you in trouble. You don't assume that anybody knows everything, but in this situation, it really can be an issue for you if you don't make sure that they fully understand their code of conduct and what is expected of them. Establish your volunteer policies. We have given you many tools and resources to use. We didn't talk much about the special events manual, but feel free to go through that. That gives you different suggestions on how to get ready for those big special events. Make sure you're always communicating with your volunteers. Your volunteer manual should be a living, breathing document. It needs to be revised annually. It's not something you're going to do once and then sit on the shelf. We want you to make sure you're updating it regularly. Make sure that you document, get everything in writing, and then everybody in your town has the responsibility of risk management. So we want to make sure that it's not only held to one person, that everybody that's involved in your department or your municipality understands that risk management truly is everyone's responsibility. And I think that brings us to...
Yeah, let's look at some questions here. One of the questions is, does volunteering in a municipality include appointed and elected officials as well? That's a great question. And under the FLSA as well as New Hampshire law, elected officials are not employees. They're not considered employees, so they're not subject to things like minimum wage. But you're correct that for the most part, our elected and appointed officials are a type of volunteer. They're not employees. They don't get paid hourly wage. They don't get paid compensation, and normally they get paid nothing or some nominal stipend or fee sort of for their service. So they're considered a type of volunteer and not an employee. Another question, where do you find additional information regarding court-ordered community service? Kerry, I don't know if you have any other additional information based on your years of experience.
We worked with our local law enforcement office, so I would say reach out to them and ask them, because sometimes they may have folks that come to them that are looking for that, and if you've never had that connection before, you can make it. Yeah.
And I think too, thinking back to the question earlier about, you know, what about court-ordered individuals? They're not volunteering freely. If the concern with that question was, are we going to get in trouble for using them because they're not volunteering freely? The answer is no. This is a court requirement. They have to engage in this community service, so you don't need to worry about yourself or some kind of liability. Another question is, if the youth skill camp provides a written document stating they do require background check, will we be meeting the RSA requirement? So I don't know if this is a youth skill camp that the municipality is running or someone else is running.
Sounds like they're bringing somebody else in to do it, and then let's say XYZ clinic provides a document that says we've done a background check.
Yep. I think that would be fine if the town, as long as they're certifying that as they're required to do under the Department of Environmental Services rules, and it's not your youth skill camp that you're running. Do you have any other thoughts on that? I think that's the same question as, does this apply if a nonprofit soccer club wants to run a soccer camp on our municipal field?
That's a little bit different.
Okay.
So if you have an organization, a youth soccer league, you're going to want to check to make sure what their policies and procedures are in terms of background checks, because you want to make sure that the coaches that are running it have had background checks. Because if you're not directly linked or related to that organization, and there are a lot of different youth leagues and organizations out there. I know the major ones, the baseballs, the footballs, they require folks to go through that background check process, but it's more of just making sure you have that conversation that if you're going to allow someone, are you renting the fields? We're going to get into a different issue there. Are they just using the municipality fields for their own?
I think it depends really on all the circumstances of how this program is falling out. Is it really just someone else using municipal fields, or is it somehow the municipality is involved in running the program? I think I'd need some more facts on that as well. Another question is, youth certificate is for paid or unpaid volunteers, i.e. the counselor in training not being paid. Do they need a youth certificate?
We always got them.
Yeah, this is what I would say. I agree that to some extent it's a little bit confusing, because 276-A, which is the youth employment statute, seemingly applies to employment, and we're talking here about volunteering versus being an employee. But what I would say is that the statute says that youths are allowed to engage in that, quote, casual work without needing that certificate. And that casual work is the work of infrequent or brief duration or little or sporadic income, that sort of thing. But if you're going to have something more than casual work, if you're going to have them sort of volunteering day after day throughout the summer, I do think that it applies, that the certificate requirement applies as well in that circumstance.
Yep. All right. So. Whoops, went backwards again.
Thank you, Kerry, and thank you, Margaret. We did have one of our webinar attendees indicate that they Googled, and apparently the state of New Hampshire may have up to 92 state parks. So I think the answer is anywhere between 42 and 92.
We have a lot, so get outside.
And we hope that you can give us the answers some later date. But for upcoming attractions, we do have on May 24th, Alan Gould from Municipal Resources Incorporated, who will be giving a webinar on references to records checks. best practices for background investigations. Seems timely since we've just talked about it. And we have our popular legislative wrap-up on June 28th, and that's Cordell Johnston and Barbara Reed, who'll be part of that presentation. We also have next week, Monday, April 17th, a Lean White Belt workshop. We hope that you'll consider participating in this workshop. And if not, then we've got a Right to Know workshop on June 8th. And we do not yet have the registration open for that. That still is a save the date. So we hope that if you're interested in learning more about the Right to Know law, that you'll save June 8th for us. And also we have just, we're in the final throes of putting together a new publication. It's called A Guide to Open Government, New Hampshire's Right to Know Law, and it will hopefully be a valuable resource tool for all of municipal officials moving forward. And we also have in May, and this is a calendar event on our website. You can register today, but we have Mark Broth and Anna Cole from Drummond Woodsum Law Firm coming to give us the updates of employment law and hot trends and developments. So that is a calendared event. You can register. And similarly, they have been very kind to us here at NHMA, and they're offering a free employment law hotline service. The number is 603-623-2500. Should you, there are some conditions to that, and you can find that in our news link as well. And this brings a conclusion. We thank the members of the New Hampshire Parks and Recreation Association. We thank our members, NHMA, and special thanks to Kerry and to Margaret. Again, this will be put into a YouTube production. We'll be sending that out to you in a couple days, and we hope that you'll circulate that with your friends and colleagues.
Thank you, Jim.